Hi, Misha here, and I've talked about this plane, this model before. This is the Douglas Skyhawk. This is the A-4E John McCain commemorative from Hobby Master. And I thought we'd revisit and talk more in depth, mostly because I felt like it, and get a couple more models in. This is an early Hobby Master. This is an A-4C. This was the first all-weather or night fighter radar-equipped version of the Skyhawk, initially known as the A-4D 2N. The E over here was very briefly known as the A-4D 5. These two would be amongst the most heavily produced, with over 600 and nearly 500 respectively. And then finally, we have the U.S. Marines A-4M. This was pretty much the ultimate version of the Skyhawk. It had upgraded avionics. It's got a hump behind the cockpit. The cockpit itself was made larger. In just under 160 of these would be built, but this would be the last version built through the 70s. Between 1954 and 1979, just under 3,000 Skyhawks would be produced by first Douglas, later McDonnell Douglas. They would see military service from late 1956 through, honestly, a few of them still in service to this very day. And they weren't actually retired out of U.S. Marine service until the late 90s and U.S. Navy service in the early 21st century. Although their frontline service was relatively brief, at least in the USA. This is also not just an American plane, but it was well used in the Israeli Air Force, IAF, and quite famously by Argentina during the Falklands War, where it went up against the Harrier and Sea Harrier. It's an interesting little plane that kind of goes against the design aesthetics that were coming more and more in vogue in the late 50s and 60s. It's small and simplistic, built to be easy to maintain, durable. It was designed as a ground attack plane, fighter bomber, with limited fighter capability. It earned a lot of nicknames over the years, including Heineman's Hot Rod for the designer Ed Heineman. Also called the Bantam Bomber, or the Scooter, or the Tinker Toy Bomber for its small size. And has a very interesting and rich history that I thought we would get a little into here. Why not? And then also compare these models. By the way, the A-4C, as I said, is from Hobby Master. This over here, the A-4M, is from Corgi. And all three are 1/72 scale die-cast. So, let's get right into it. Like I said, this is the A-4C, initially known as the A-4D-2N. That designating system, especially for the Navy, was confusing as hell. Glad they changed it. Well, this dates back to the early 1950s. And in my A-10 video, I showed a Hobby Master model of the A-1 Skyraider, which the Air Force kind of inherited from the Navy. That was manufactured by Douglas. And in the early 50s, the Navy, along with the Marine Corps, was already looking at what to replace the propeller-driven Skyraider with. And initial specifications were kind of laid out. It needed to be able to get up to about 580 miles per hour, have a max takeoff weight of about 30,000 pounds, be able to carry a usable, substantial payload, and then the specs were very quickly upgraded, frankly. Well, in January of '52, a team at Douglas, led by Ed Heinemann, got to work designing a new jet. And really there was no competition. Already by June, a contract for 2 prototypes was awarded to the company. This would be the A-4D. And even before the prototype could be built, the contract was changed to just 1 prototype and 19 pre-production models known as YA-4D. And so they were working hard in 1953, and by early June of '54, the first prototype was ready to go. Got a lick of paint, and Douglas designated it as the Skyhawk. It flew later that month. It performed very well, and so the pre-production was authorized and moved ahead very quickly. In 1955, this plane set a speed record for its class. It reached 695 miles per hour, stripped down, not armed. And testing began for carrier landings and takeoffs. So with rapid progress, by 1956, full-scale production was authorized. And so the first full production model was known as the A-4D-1. And the Navy would receive its first planes in September-October of 1956, and the Marines would start to get their first planes by the end of that year. Now, by 1957, a better version, essentially, known as the A-4D-2, was introduced. And this would be the first version to have wet hardpoints for external fuel tanks. It would also have improved avionics. It would have ability to carry a nuclear weapon. It would have an improved engine and other little tweaks and whatnot. And then in 1960, this version here would appear. The A-4D-2N was the first all-weather, aka night fighter, or inclement weather version, meaning it had a radar on board. It was also hoped to give it an uprated, a better, more improved, a more thrust engine, but this would have to wait. It just wasn't possible. So they did what they could with the engine they had. They did improve the electronics and the avionics. They also gave it a new low-altitude bombing system known as LABS. And this would be the first version to really go into major use and service. So what do we have? Well, we have, as you can see, hopefully I'm getting something on camera. Doing my best, guys. Blind, usual caveat I have to mention. We have a delta wing design, which is very 1950s and very cool. Delta wings are relatively cheap to build and durable. It is a single jet engine aircraft with a split or dual intake in the front. You notice the fixed refueling probe. Very early on with the AD4-2, this plane would be capable of buddy refueling. It could carry up to 3 external fuel tanks, center line and then the sides, giving much more combat options. It was a single-seat aircraft with a combat load. It was capable of about 670 miles per hour, so subsonic, but still well above the initial requirement. Had a max altitude, depending on the exact variant, between 40 and 45,000 feet. It was just a hair over 40 feet long. Had a 27.5-foot wingspan. Initially, it had 3 hard points, 1 under the fuselage and 1 under each wing, although later versions would have 5, and older ones like this could be upgraded to have a total of 5. It would have the bomb-carrying capability of a World War II B-17, so roughly 8,000 pounds, although some later versions could bump that up a bit. As standard, it had 2 Colt Mark 12 20mm cannons with 100 rounds each, so not a large, but at least it had cannons. It's a small enough plane that it could fit on board World War II Essex-class aircraft carriers, and it did not require folding wings. And that kind of gets to the whole point of this plane. It was designed to be simple and dependable. The wings are fixed. The engine was nothing terribly new or remarkable, but it got the job done. The landing gear were even made as simple as possible. Most of the advancements would be with its targeting. It was known to be a very accurate plane for delivering ordnance on the ground. It could also carry AIM-9 sidewinders, originally 2, later 4, for self-defense. Interestingly, this was the first U.S. Navy aircraft to be stationed outside of the U.S. overseas that was armed as standard with sidewinders. And one reason I went ahead and kind of loaded this one down, when I put it on my display, I might take off the extra weapons to give it more of the sea vibe. But it commonly carried Zuni rocket pods, each with 4 rockets in, those long skinny ones. And then it would have MER, multiple ejector rack ordnance. It could carry napalm, it could carry just iron bombs. And that's what it mostly did, was attack the ground. Especially early on, most of it was pretty dumbfire ordnance. In the early 1960s, before Vietnam, the Skyhawk was used often to escort and protect anti-submarine patrols throughout the Pacific and Atlantic, going against Russian subs. Again, it was good that they could operate off of older carriers, of course newer carriers as well. It was a very economical choice. This thing initially came in at half the allowed weight, and it actually came in under budget. I believe the Navy in the 1950s allotted up to $1 million per plane, and the first versions were around $800,000, $850,000. So underweight, under budget, and it was delivered ahead of schedule because it wasn't breaking new technological ground in a sense. It was just tried and true, and they were trying to keep things simple as possible. KISS, keep it simple, stupid. Which is what the motto was rumored to be when developing this at Douglas. So thankfully in 1962, the U.S., kind of one of the smart things that came out of the McNamara and all that, ordered a simplification and a joining of the U.S. Navy, Marines, and aircraft designation, and this became the A-4 Skyhawk. The initial pre-production models and initial Dash 1s became the A-4A, and then the Dash 2s became the A-4Bs, and then the Dash 2Ns, the first night fighter here, became the A-4C. The A's really weren't used. There were not that many were made. So by the time of the Vietnam War kicking off in '64, the A-4B and the A-4C were the U.S. Navy's primary ground attack fighter bomber aircraft. Meant they were deployed over very quickly. In fact, an A-4 was the first American plane to be shot down in the Vietnam War in August of 1964, and its pilot became the first official POW. Interestingly, an A-4 was shot down in 1972, being the last official POW. But I digress. These were used early on for close air support and to attack critical targets, because again they were very accurate, and they could operate off of virtually any aircraft carrier. They were well liked for their pilots for being very maneuverable, even at lower speeds, which some jets are not, and just pretty forgiving and straightforward to fly. They were also known for being very tough. They could take a beating and get their pilots to safety, at least a better than even chance. That said, in 1967, two things happened. The first and only Skyhawk was shot down by a MiG, but then, in return, a Skyhawk shot down the first and only MiG, so kind of a one-for-one deal. Again, this wasn't a fighter plane. Also, in June of '67, a very tragic event happened on the USS Forstall, where one of these Zuni rockets misfired, striking the external fuel tank of another Skyhawk, starting a major fire that burned for at least 4 to 5 hours, killing or wounding nearly 300 American sailors. I mean, a tragic accident, but in wartime. And that kind of brings me to the combat record. Although 366 were reported as lost during the war, there was just the one shot down by a MiG, and only 32 were reported shot down by either surface-to-air missiles or anti-aircraft fire. Most, over 300, were lost to just mishaps, accidents, mechanical failures, human error, what have you, such as war. Luckily, many pilots did eject and escape and lived, but not all. Well, the A-4B and A-4C were pretty much retired out of frontline service in the Navy by 1970, although they started to be phased out as early as October of 1967. And that leads us to the next versions, the E and the F. Now, on to the A-4E, although it was very briefly known as the A-4D-5. There was never a -3 or a -4 built, they were just concepts. Really, this was coming into production right as the name change was coming in, so yeah, it was really the A-4E. And this was considered a major upgrade. The big deal was we finally get a new engine that provides exponentially better thrust, meaning better acceleration, better ability to carry ordnance, and this is where the 5 hard points, 2 under each wing, become standard. And this one has on it the 2 external fuel tanks, which were almost always carried. Even a third could be carried under the center line, which I can't do on this model and keep it on the stand. Hobby Master thing. But that's because the internal fuel capacity of the Skyhawk was pretty small. I think that's why the A-4B came out so quickly in '57, so they could have an actual range. The whole buddy refueling system worked well. Essentially, you would load up most of your aircraft with full payloads, and then have one takeoff with just fuel tanks, and so you get your other guys off the ground, you'd top them off using your buddy plane, that way they would have more payload and more range. It's something that can still be done today with the FA-18s, Super Hornets, but is usually not done unless a tanker is not available, but it was an option. So additionally to the engine, we have a new TOS bombing computer for yet better accuracy. We have new avionics, new electronics. The airframe was strengthened to deal with the additional hardpoints. And a new missile was able to be used, the AGM-12 Bullpup. This was a remote-guided missile. The pilot from the Skyhawk could use essentially a TV camera to guide it to its target. It wasn't perfect. It definitely had some shortcomings, but this is, the mid-1960s. So it's one of the earlier guided weapons before laser guidance was coming into use. And it was a relatively powerful warhead, especially later versions of the Bullpup. But yeah, the A-4E was the first to be able to use the Bullpup. It still had the 2 20mm cannons with 100 rounds each. And these started to appear in Vietnam in early 1965 and would operate alongside the Bs and Cs for a couple of years. But after the Bs were pulled out of service and the Cs were pulled out of service, the Es would continue on through 1969, 1970, and so on and so forth into the 70s. And the U.S. Marines would also fly these. It's basically just a more capable version with more ordnance options. Not a lot of difference in the 2 Hobby Master models, aside from slightly larger intakes on this one and the different ordnance. But I wanted the McCain version, so why not? The largest user of the Skyhawk outside of the USA was Israel. After relations with France started to fall apart, the US started to offer them aircraft in the late 60s, with the first Skyhawks being sent over to Israel in 1966. They would have a mix of models. They would outright buy over 200, and then around 50 would be taken from U.S. Navy stockpiles. They would even have their own version known as the A-4H that had a slightly uprated engine and had 30mm cannon instead of 20. But the IAF would use these during the Yom Kippur War. It would be their primary ground attack aircraft at that time, at least jet. They would lose some in combat, but they would definitely give better than they got, doing a considerable amount of damage to Israel's enemies. And they were very popular in the Israeli Air Force. Their last combat mission wasn't until 2012, and their last service was in 2015. By the end of the year, they had a major retirement ceremony, and they were replaced by newer planes like F-16s. But they were greatly appreciated. Kuwait was another user of the Skyhawk, including a few combat sorties. And the U.S. Navy and U.S. Marines especially would continue to use these heavily throughout Vietnam and afterwards. And they would continue to improve ordnance such as the bullpup missile. Later they would be upgraded to use even more modern ordnance. And production and improvements would still be continued on. And our final Skyhawk, the A-4M. This was the last major version or variant, last production. Nicknamed the Mike, and often referred to as the Skyhawk 2 because of many changes and differences from previous versions. Well, this dates back to the A-4F, which was introduced in 1967 for the Navy and the Marines. It was the first to introduce this so-called hump behind the cockpit. That was to give more room for avionics, sensors, electronics, what have you. It was always kind of an optional piece. The F would also go to a more modern ejection seat. It would have a more refined engine. And so on and so forth. The hump was the big difference. It would also have improved front landing gear and spoilers on the wings. Just so you know, the A-4G was for Australia, and the A-4K was for New Zealand. Well, when the U.S. Navy decided they were going to replace their Skyhawks with the new A-7 from LVT, VAT, the Marines were not keen. They liked their Skyhawks. It suited the Marines' close air support, simple, dependable mindset. Well, so not only did they continue using the A-4, not only did they continue buying new A-4s, they ended up with the M model here, designed by McDonnell Douglas in the 70s. We have the hump, we have an improved, larger, more comfortable, more modern cockpit. The aerial refueling probe was refined. The rear stabilizer was reshaped. The engine was again upgraded to deliver more thrust. It went from 100 rounds per 20mm cannon to 200 rounds per cannon, so a total of 400 cannon rounds on board, which you can imagine was helpful to the Marines. And it would later, towards the end, receive a new bombing aiming system designed by Hughes. to keep it as up to date as possible, and that's one of the plane's enduring strengths. Its straightforward design meant it could be easily upgraded and modernized, and its airframe was so durable that with a good rebuild it was virtually unlimited. It just didn't wear out. Well, the U.S. Navy, as I said, started to pull its Skyhawks from frontline service in the late 60s. In 1976, it took its last A-4Fs, sometimes referred to as Super Foxes, out of carrier service, meaning they're gone. The Marines were still taking delivery. They got their last A-4M in 1979, and that's when finally McDonnell Douglas now shut down the production line after 25 years. But they would definitely continue to use the Skyhawk. It was their primary ground attack fighter bomber in the 1980s. It was first replaced by the AV-8B Harrier and later the FA-18 Hornet in the Marine Corps. Interestingly, the Blue Angels adopted the Skyhawk in 1975, replacing their older F-4s. It was both more maneuverable and more economical to fly, so worked well for them post-Vietnam. And another noteworthy user, as I mentioned, was Argentina. Well, Israel was the largest user, but Argentina was the first. They received their first Skyhawks in 1965. They initially got B models, later C models. They would acquire up to 130. And they would use just under 50, I think it was around 48 during the Falklands War. They would lose a number of them, I think 20, 22, something like that. But they would sink 2 British warships and damage multiple others with their Skyhawks. So while they did not go toe-to-toe and survive well with the Harrier, they did prove that they could still attack vessels and be successful. And the Argentine Navy continued to modernize their A-4s, which is really a story for another video, but they kept them in frontline service and kept them as up-to-date as possible despite sanctions and embargoes well into the 21st century, and technically some are still in Argentinian service today, although of course by now it's pretty well out. Back to America. The U.S. Marine Corps started to retire its Skyhawks in the early 90s and retired its last A-4M in 1994. Now, interestingly, the Navy would keep on flying Skyhawks as adversary and training aircraft, including at the famous Top Gun school, all throughout the 80s and 90s. This was felt to be a great aggressor to replicate the abilities of older MiGs like the MiG-17. Its delta shape and design and all that. It gave what it needed. And later planes like the A-4M, when they were stripped of armament, they were maneuverable, zippy little bastards. The latest engines delivered a good bit of push, and if it didn't have 7,000-8,000 pounds worth of bombs to haul around, it could really get up and go. Still wasn't supersonic, of course, but it was maneuverable. So it, again, was very cheap to fly and easy to keep running, thanks all the way back to Heineman's design. So the Navy didn't start to retire these from aggressor status until 1999. And then the last ones to be out of American service were actually the TA-80 A-4F 2-seat versions, originally designed as to be trainers. Late in their lives, they were used for target tugs, spotter aircraft, test aircraft, and the last of these were pulled out around 2002, 2003. So, over 20 years after manufacturing ended. Wish I had a model of a TA-4, but I can't find one in 1/72 scale. This one here is an example of a late A-4M, as flown in the early 90s. As you can tell, it doesn't have any ordnance under the wings, so it's more in an aggressor configuration. A very cool little aircraft, which is why I have 3 models of the A4. And that's more detailed history. I thought it deserved it. I think it's a neat story. The airplanes themselves. The Corgi model here is your typical Corgi, gear up or down. Very solid metal construction. Got a pilot figure, but the canopy does not open. So pretty much your only articulation is gear up or down, but that's okay. It is a pretty faithful A-4M with the hump, and it has the larger cockpit and the reshaped stabilizer. The intakes have been changed. Has the little spoiler looking things on the wings. So, yeah. Like I said, the A-4C over here is the oldest one. Probably should only have the one ordnance under each wing, but I don't know. I thought loaded up. Like I said, we can call it an upgrade, A-4Q or whatever. This is just kind of a generic U.S. Navy from the 60s configuration. Pretty neat, still yet. It comes with a good bit of ordnance. Actually, the Zuni rocket pods didn't come from it. They came from the McCain one, but I thought they looked good on this. I wanted to show one with the kind of cluster bombs and the rocket pods. Its canopy does open with removable pilot figure, as well as gear up or down, of course. And then, of course, the John McCain that you saw in an older video. I wanted this one just for the McCain, plus the bullpup missiles look good on it. They're appropriate for an E, along with the auxiliary fuel tanks. So kind of a different setup, showing the versatility. But yeah, one thing I like that all these manufacturers did, I think knowing that, it's kind of a brittle point, the refueling probes on all of these are kind of more of a flexible rubber material. They're not a hard plastic, which is just a brilliant call, because it will get dinked around a bit, unfortunately. That's just kind of how it works. But yeah, hope you enjoyed this deeper look at the little hot rod, the Tinker Toy, the Bantam Bomber. I think Scooter is my favorite nickname. What's your favorite? Well, with that said, I think I'll call it a night. Feel free to comment below. As always, I appreciate it. And I will catch you very soon next time.